On February 9th of 1874, 6 men walked into the snowy San Juan Mountains of Colorado. Only one man made it out alive. When the survivor stumbled into the streets of Saguache, everyone was amazed that he had managed to brave such harsh conditions. Not only did he survive, but he looked incredibly healthy and suspiciously well-fed. It wasn't long before the townspeople began asking questions, and that's when the truth came out. This man had resorted to extreme measures in order to stave off death and hunger. He had eaten the corpses of 5 men. The individual's name was Alfred Packer, and he would go down in history as one of Colorado's most horrific and yet strangely beloved survivalists. By his own admission, he was also a cannibal. But what actually happened during that arduous, freezing trek through the San Juan Mountains? Why did Packer decide to eat his companions? Did they die from natural causes before he dined on their flesh? Or did he murder them in a crazed effort to survive? Let's find out. Packer was originally born in Pennsylvania in the 1840s, and he had begun working as a shoemaker during his teen years in Minnesota. He then served in the Union Army during the Civil War, but was honorably discharged due to his epilepsy, despite repeatedly trying to re-enlist. Apparently, his epilepsy was so bad that he suffered seizures every 2 days. During this period, he gained a reputation as being untrustworthy, as he regularly stole items and lied to those around him. Various people described him as quarrelsome. Before he became one of America's most notorious cannibals, Alfred Packer was just another prospector drawn to the Rocky Mountains in search of gold and silver. And like most of these prospectors, Alfred didn't actually profit much from the gold rush. His mining income was so poor, in fact, that he was forced to search for other ways to make money. He eventually became a wilderness guide, but he was by no means qualified to hold this position. By all accounts, he had only a cursory knowledge of the Utah and Colorado wilderness, and was prone to losing his way. In November of 1873, exciting news arrived in Salt Lake City. Gold had been discovered in Breckenridge, Colorado. Lots of it. But there was one problem. Breckenridge was over the San Juan Mountains, and anyone who attempted to make the journey would have to put their survival skills to the test. 20 men decided that they were up to the job, and they left Salt Lake City soon thereafter. Just a few days into their journey, they encountered Alfred Packer, who asked them where they were headed. The 20 men told them about the reports of gold in Breckenridge, and Packer immediately said that he wanted to go with. The men were reluctant at first, and for good reason. Packer didn't have any money, and he didn't have the necessary supplies to make the trek. But eventually, the others decided that he was too valuable to leave behind. After all, Alfred said he knew the San Juan Mountains like the back of his hand. But this was a lie. Packer had no idea how to guide these people through the mountains, a fact that became clear within days. To make matters worse, he started arguments with them, ate too many rations, and was generally quite lazy. His constant seizures didn't exactly help either. Soon, they became lost, thanks to Packer's guidance. Food began to run out. The winter became worse. Their goal quickly shifted. Reaching Breckenridge wasn't important anymore. They simply needed to survive. Starving and desperate, The men were saved by a miracle. They stumbled onto a Native American village near Montrose, and to their amazement, they were welcomed in with open arms. The leader of the tribe was Chief Ouray, and he promised to keep them well fed until the spring had arrived. But Ouray also had something else to give these men, a stern warning not to continue into the San Juan Mountains until after winter had passed. He said that any attempt to continue would be suicide, and none of his people would ever even try such a foolish journey. Most of the men listened, but 11 of them were completely entranced by the promise of gold. They weren't about to sit around while others were draining Breckenridge for all it was worth. They ignored Chief Ouray's advice and continued on. And of course, Alfred Packer was one of these men. Once again, this epileptic, self-professed survival expert tried to convince everyone that only he knew the best route to Breckenridge. Chief Ouray had advised them to go around the mountains and to follow the Gunnison River to safety. But Packer claimed that this Native American didn't know what the hell he was talking about, and that he was much more familiar with the Colorado area. Another lie, but for whatever reason, some of the men agreed to follow him into certain doom. Out of the 11, 5 followed the Gunnison River, almost starving to death before being rescued by cowhands. The remaining 6 followed Alfred Packer, setting out into the mountains on February 9th. These men were Shannon Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Butch Miller, George California Noon, and Israel Swan. They were faced with a 75-mile journey, and they had no snowshoes, no matches, no winter clothes, and only 14 days worth of food. This is when things started to go seriously wrong. And to be honest, no one really knows what happened over the next 2 months. What we do know is that Alfred Packer was the only one to make it out alive. On April 16th of 1874, Packer emerged from the wilderness near Saguache in Colorado. He was a mess, desperately begging for food with nothing but rags tied around his feet. Packer was given a hot meal and whiskey at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. Having been fed and liquored up a little, Alfred began to tell his story. Initially, he claimed that he had been abandoned by the others, and that he had been forced to survive on nothing but rosebuds, roots, rabbits, and squirrels. But this story was highly suspicious right from the start, because Packer didn't look like he was starving. In fact, he looked pretty healthy, and some reports even described him as bloated. Although they didn't really believe his story, the men at the Indian Agency simply shrugged and allowed him to go on his way. Packer then aroused even more suspicion after walking into town and spending hundreds of dollars, the equivalent of thousands in today's money. Some saw him pay with many different wallets that belonged to the other 5 men in his expedition. He drank heavily, and his story seemed to change each time he told it. Things went from bad to worse when some of the men who had been staying at Ouray's camp arrived in Saguache. A man named Preston Nutter recognized Packer and immediately asked him what happened to the other 5 men. Packer gave the same story, but Nutter had a good eye. He noticed that Alfred was carrying items that had belonged to the other men. In fact, he was carrying their most valuable possessions, such as Israel's expensive hunting rifle and Frank's prized skinning knife. Nutter was convinced Packer had done something terrible. Meanwhile, the men who had been rescued by the cowhands arrived in the same area, and after hearing his story, they also became convinced Packer was lying. This was enough to convince the local authorities, who arrested Alfred Packer on suspicion of murder. While he was questioned, 2 Native Americans rushed in with strips of dried meat that they had found on a nearby hillside. It was human flesh. Upon seeing the remains of his former companions, Packer broke down and promised to make a full confession. He began by uttering the following words: "It would not be the first time that people had been obligated to eat each other when they were hungry." Faced with few options, Packer was forced to come clean about what had happened in the San Juan Mountains. After a few days, the group ran out of food. They managed to survive for a few days on roots, rosebuds, and rabbits, but it wasn't enough. According to Packer, Israel Swan was the first to fall victim to cannibalism. Slain with a hatchet, robbed of his possessions, and quickly consumed by the others. Miller went next, chosen for his soft flesh and slain with a hatchet before being butchered and consumed. It wasn't long before Humphrey suffered the same fate, and when hunger struck again, George Noon also found himself on the butcher's block. Finally, only Shannon Bell and Alfred Packer remained. The two apparently swore not to eat each other, and they agreed that they would tell everyone that the other 4 men simply froze to death. But it was only a matter of time before the inevitable occurred. One night, Bell snapped and rushed at Packer with murder and hunger in his eyes. Somehow, Packer managed to reach for his hatchet in time before killing Bell in self-defense. With a fresh corpse lying dead in front of him, Packer started preparing his next meal. After eating as much as possible, Alfred packed away a few strips of dried flesh and continued on. It was at this point that he emerged from the wilderness as a changed man, one who sheepishly admitted he had grown fond of human flesh, particularly the portion around the breast. Well, that's the story according to Packer. The only people who know whether this account is accurate are the 5 men who died during the doomed trek into the mountains. The local authorities were furious with Packer after hearing his story, but they were willing to believe him at first, and they searched for evidence that would confirm certain details of his account. But as they headed into the wilderness to look for this evidence, Packer attempted to murder one of the guides with a concealed knife. The authorities then became convinced he was lying about everything, and Packer was sent to the Saguache jail. It was at that point that Packer told yet another story. According to this new account, the first men had died from natural causes. All of them had agreed that if someone died from the cold, they would all immediately eat the flesh to survive. While cannibalism wasn't exactly noble, it also wasn't totally frowned upon in those days. Americans of that era recognized that when faced with the freezing elements, one had to do whatever was necessary to survive. In fact, there was no law banning cannibalism in America back then. It was only illegal to kill someone before eating them. According to Packer's new story, Swan and Humphreys were the first to succumb to the frozen temperatures, and they were the eaten. But after these 2 individuals had been consumed, the others became more desperate. Eventually, Bell, Noon, and Packer got into a standoff, with all 3 raising their firearms. Bell shot first, killing Noon, and Packer then fired upon Bell. As a result, Packer was left alone. Packer would tell various versions of this story from that point on, changing certain details here and there. Eventually, the bodies of the other 5 men were discovered. Strangely, the massacre site was within walking distance of Lake City. It wasn't exactly the desperate situation that Packer had described, but of course, he was probably leading them in the wrong direction. Later, several hunters would state that the area was plenty active with large game, such as deer and antelope. In fact, a deer carcass was discovered just a few minutes from the campsite. Food was in fairly abundant supply, so why resort to cannibalism? The local authorities eventually determined that the victims had been killed due to some kind of violent altercation. Frank's head was completely missing, and Israel's skull showed signs of a blunt traumatic impact. Various victims had suffered broken bones. Several corpses, especially Bell's, seemed to have been flayed, with large strips of flesh removed in various places. But the most important aspect of the massacre site was its location. All 5 bodies were in the same place. In other words, Packer was clearly lying. They didn't all die one by one, but were instead killed at roughly the same time during a single event. A new theory emerged. Packer had killed the others before they ran out of supplies, intending to rob them all. Faced with the frozen temperatures, however, he decided to set up camp and slowly consume the corpses until he was ready to move on. Amazingly, Alfred managed to escape from jail while the authorities were examining the massacre site. 9 years passed and Packer lived as an outlaw before being discovered by yet another member of the original expedition. After Packer's presence was reported, he was sent back to Lake City to stand trial. It was at this moment that Packer gave another completely different account of what had happened during the original expedition. This new account painted Bell as a villain who had slaughtered the others in cold blood. Packer had simply discovered the crime and fired upon the murderer in the act. With no other options, he then consumed the flesh of the 5 slain victims. But he was not a killer, he insisted. The jury had other ideas, and he was found guilty of premeditated murder. The sentence was death by hanging, and the judge had this to say to Alfred when he was sentenced. "Stand up, you voracious man-eating son of a bitch, and receive your sentence. When you came to Hinsdale County, there was 7 Democrats, but you ate 5 of them, goddamn you. I sentence you by hanging by the neck until you're dead. Dead, dead. As a warning, again, reducing the Democratic population of this country. Packer, you, Republican cannibal, I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it." Packer had one more trick up his sleeve. His lawyers managed to find an insane loophole, one that stated that the government could not sentence a man to death for committing a crime before Colorado had become an official state. A second trial occurred, and he was convicted on 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. Escaping the death sentence, he nonetheless spent decades in prison before finally getting paroled in 1901. He lived in freedom for just 6 more years before dying at the age of 65 in Deer Creek, Colorado. For many years, people had the opportunity to visit the massacre site for themselves. However, the site was eventually permanently closed for unknown reasons, and a review on Google Maps reads, "The owner does not want visitors." Nevertheless, it is an interesting piece of American history, and a stark reminder to never underestimate the power of Mother Nature. One thing is certain, if these adventurers had simply listened to the advice of Chief Ure, they would have made it out of that inhospitable, frozen wilderness alive.